Hey, everybody, welcome to Red May, your 1 month vacation from capitalism. And today we have the rest and the West, capital and power in a multipolar world with Brett Nielsen and Sandro Mezzadra and Carl Kubler of McGill University to moderate. Before we start on today's program, though, I want to clue you into what we've got coming up tomorrow at 11 a.m. Pacific time. Citizen Marx, Republicanism and Formation of Marxist Thought. That's based on a wonderful new book here by Bruno Leopold. Well, got the book. Book doesn't seem to come into the. There it is. Here we go. Citizen Marx, a great book, and we'll have the author Bruno Leopold with Camilla Vergara and Michael Hart. On Thursday at 11 a.m., American Constitutional Collapse. Aziz Rana, author of The Constitutional Bind, Michael Hartigan and Camila Vergara. I'll be moderating that one. And if you're in Seattle on this Sunday night at 5 p.m. at Elliott Bay Books, we have Enemy Feminisms, TERFs, Policewomen and Girl Bosses. That'll be Sophie Lewis in conversation with Emi Koyama. So a lot of great stuff coming up with Red May. Check out our website, www.redmayseattle.org, for the complete schedule. And now, without further ado, let me turn you over to Kyle Kubler of McGill, who will moderate today's event.
Thanks, Philip, and thanks for everyone who is watching. Like Philip said, we have a great panel today to talk about a really excellent book, something that I found super helpful just in terms of sort of setting the stage for the appropriate debates and conversations to be having in our multipolar world. Before we jump into our panel, I did just want to make a quick pitch for money. You'll see two pitches right below on the bottom there of your screen. We are completely listener and volunteer funded. If you'd like to make a one-time donation, you can do so at the GoFundMe account. So this is gofundme.com/takeabreakfromcapitalism. That's the link right below. And if you'd like to be a sustaining donor, you can also do that on our Patreon account, which is patreon.com/redmayseattle. All of these links and more information about our organization, as well as about future events coming up through the rest of May, can be found on our website at redmayseattle.org. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our guest for today. So we'll start with Sandro Mezzadra. Sandro is a professor of political theory in the Department of Arts at the University of Bologna, and also a research fellow at the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University. A lot of his work over the last decade has centered on the relation between globalization, migration, and political processes on contemporary capitalism, post-colonial theory, and criticism. We also have the co-author of the book, Brett Nielsen. Brett Nielsen is a professor and the deputy director at the Institute for Culture and Society at West Sydney University. And his work has also centered on issues of migration, borders, globalization, logistics and digitalization, contemporary capitalism, geopolitics, and automation. Brett and Sandro, welcome again. Sandro has also been a long-time Red May contributor through some of our sort of the social media lab, the social movements lab work that we did also with Michael Hart a few years ago. So good to see you again, Sandro, and very excited to hear you all talk about your book.
Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be back at Red May Seattle.
And
indeed, the book aims at providing an analysis of the conjuncture. And in particular, we focus on the relation between the pandemic and the Ukraine war. This relation is indeed a conjunctural relation. It's not a kind of structural relation. But nonetheless, it is compelling. In a way, the concatenation between pandemic and the Ukraine war contributed to promoting further entrenching kind of global turmoil, a situation of systemic chaos that was long in preparation, at least since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. We look at this kind of conjunctural relation between the pandemic and the Ukraine war from the point of view of an analysis of contemporary capitalism, and we focus our attention in particular on the challenges to logistics and the reorganization of supply chains that were distinctive features both of the pandemic and the Ukraine war, although under different conditions. So this notion of conjuncture is important for us. And of course, we have to add that the conjuncture is unpredictable and shifting, mobile. We delivered the manuscript of the book in May 2023, which means several months before October 7. So we don't speak in the book about what is happening in Gaza, the kind of genocidal war that is ongoing in Gaza. And of course, we don't speak of Trump. But in a way, we are convinced that some of the trends that we analyze in the book are confirmed and further entrenched by recent developments. That is, of course, something new. And in particular, I would like to mention the fact that when we wrote the book, territorial expansion seemed to be a kind of distinctive feature of just Russian imperialism. And we stress this fact, but nowadays we are confronted with a coming back of the issue of territorial expansion. Just think of what is going on in and around Gaza. Just think of Lebanon, of Syria. But of course, there is a need to mention also President Trump's statements regarding Panama, regarding Canada, regarding Greenland. So it seems in a way that we are confronted with a new stage of what I was calling before global turmoil, systemic chaos, a stage in which we confront the coming back, the seeming coming back of imperialism in its most traditional forms. And what is clear is that nowadays we are confronted with shifting boundaries, both national borders and frontiers of capital are in a way again on the move, and this is part and parcel of the systemic chaos that we analyze in the book. A last point to start has to do with the fact that both the pandemic and war require huge investments from public and private actors. And this has to do with the fact that health and war are eminent domains for profit making. And from this point of view, they provide excellent entry points into the analysis of the shifting relations between, let's say, territorial and capitalist actors. But nowadays, it is quite clear that the war is prevailing in orienting public spending and public policies in many parts of the world, including, of course, Europe. And there is a need to ask what this means. What this means in terms of the proliferation of what we call in the book war regimes, but also in terms of the spread of authoritarianism, of processes of hardening of social relations, and in a way, this implies also the possibility of limiting the dynamism of the capitalist system. This is part of the stakes of the current conjuncture, a conjuncture that is more and more a conjuncture of war.
Thank you. I think the question around conjuncture is obviously really key to the analysis in this book, and I was curious if maybe you could just earlier when you were speaking, you said it's not structural, it's conjunctural, and I'm curious if you could maybe come back to that a little bit, Sandro or Brett, and just talk about if we see both war and pandemic as these sort of conjunctural components. What are then some of the underlying structural components that those interact with? I think that would be sort of a clarifying view of how these things are relating to each other, because I think throughout the book there's this feeling that capital is acting in these different ways, and the state is trying to, this will get into a discussion of your sort of inversion of political capitalism, which we'll talk about later. But I'm curious if you could just sort of make some of the distinctions between the structural and the conjunctural.
Well, I think it's an important question. One of the dilemmas for us in writing about the conjuncture and geopolitics and multipolarity is that these terms, as we know, have a history, and that history is heavily influenced, even encoded, by the discourse of international relations. So geopolitics is often thought of as a matter of the international relation, the relation between constituted states. Multipolarity is thought of as a kind of territorially based power structure based in military power. These are the traditional kind of checkerboard of geopolitical analysis and talk of a turn to multipolarity. But we are dissatisfied with an analysis that takes this as a given structure for a number of reasons. First of all is what we call the operations of capital, which we see constantly spilling over these limits. Second would be movements of labor, and both of us have worked significantly on the question of migration, particularly in the book called Border as Method. But we're also kind of dissatisfied with this sort of notion of a kind of domestic international divide in this book, where the what happens in the international sphere is somehow divided and separate as a separate area of political activity from what's happening on the ground within the spaces of the nation states. And this is where our analysis of reproduction, particularly in the second chapter of the book, becomes prominent. Because working on this cusp of pandemic and war, which provide the orientating points for our conjunctural analysis, we see a kind of an analytical and political channel between the two through debates on reproduction. So these are clear if we look at the point we make around the industries identified as essential during the pandemic, being largely involved in reproduction as opposed to production, but also some of the sort of structural reasons for war we see is to do with the state not fully or completely being able to control the reproduction of capital at the domestic level, not having a kind of overseeing function where different fractions of capital can be played off each other and aggregated into a kind of Gesamtkapital, to use Marx's term, that is identical with the interests of the state. So this analysis we have of production, circulation, and reproduction, which is certainly not a means of saying production is no longer important or no longer happening. To the contrary, it's expanding in the world, is at the center of the kind of flip or continuity we want to see between what's happening on the ground in certain places and the kind of changing global dynamics of power and capital. So, I mean, debates on reproduction can typically be divided into debates on the reproduction of capital and debates on the reproduction of labor, which kind of come together in this idea of social reproduction, which is, as we know, has been an important area of debate really since the 1960s, coming through feminist thought. And we use this kind of channel in order to think about how the, what is commonly identified as a crisis of reproduction, which we can see very clearly across different states. I mean, I don't need to talk about this dimension in the US for, I guess, the audience today. But just to mention a couple of other examples, we deal with the reproductive crisis in China, which is very much associated with patterns of urban-rural mobility and return, and we deal with the pension struggles in France that were unfolding at the time and were messed up with particular kind of international statements, kind of goalless statements in the wake of Macron's visit to China. So we use this kind of analytical thread of reproduction to move between the domestic and the international to try and get an analysis of global power relations and the emerging patterns of multipolarity at a level that is more structural. So this involves, in that chapter, reading through of what Marx says about reproduction and an extension of that through subsequent debates. So I don't think that's the entire answer to the question around structure, but it gives a kind of lineament of the more structural elements of our analysis.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I think it's it's nice to kind of move into the sphere of reproduction, which was one that I thought the book I think did an excellent job of kind of recapitulating some of those debates, but also trying to focus on what's at stake today. And this is just the thought that I had as I was reading through all the different sections of the book was that there seems to sort of be this story about states' power feeling like maybe like too little too late almost in a certain sense, that as a way to try and push back against some of the sort of totalizing accounts of state power sort of controlling and being the main actor at the geopolitical level. And I wonder if either of you have more to say about that relationship to reproduction, because I think some of the basic debates that are usually more found on the kind of like the Marxist side of the literature. And again, I think one of the benefits of the book for our audience that maybe hasn't had the chance to read it is the sort of the ability that both of you have to kind of weave in a lot of the Marxist literature that's often missing from maybe some of the stuff you would find in international relations or sort of like the kind of geopolitical framing of this stuff. So from the Marxist side, I think you get a lot of this question of reproduction around like, how does capital reproduce its labor force, like you mentioned, and that a lot of times there are people that will read the state's job as basically like saving capital from itself, in the sense of trying to come in at the last minute to provide these measures where intercapitalist competition would otherwise just basically, erode the working force completely. And so, I mean, given the current conjuncture, do you sort of still see reproduction as that? And if so, like is that the way that you see the sort of the state's role in reproduction? And if so, how does that look in our current conjuncture? What are some of those, I think you mentioned some of the examples in your book, but I think it could be nice to kind of, walk through some of those a little bit.
Yes, I think it is important to add that our analysis of reproduction is associated with a focus on circulation. And we look at the intertwining of reproduction and circulation to get a kind of privileged angle on the dynamics of contemporary capitalism. Brett was mentioning before essential industries as we knew them during the COVID-19 pandemic. And reproduction figures prominently, of course, in those essential industries, but the same is true for circulation. Just think of last mile logistics, but of logistics writ large. And so looking at what I was calling before the intertwining between circulation and reproduction opens kind of interesting vistas on the limits that states today encounter when they confront operations of capital. So it's a really different assemblage of state and capital that we try to analyze in the book. For me, it is important to talk about our analysis of reproduction and circulation because maybe due to the title, many people take the book as a geopolitics book. While the attempt we pursue is to tackle questions that are usually discussed from a geopolitical point of view in the framework of an original, a relatively new analysis of capital and capitalism. And this is important also for the notion of multipolarity that figures in the subtitle of the book, and that indeed is an important topic for us. Multipolarity is usually analyzed in geopolitical terms or from the angle of international relations. Of course, multipolarity today is an important keyword also in public discourse, in particular in the global south. And you have very interesting uses of the notion of multipolarity, for instance, in Brazil, while you must be aware of the fact that there are other uses of multipolarity that are for us kind of scaring, you know, just to think of Putin, of one of his chief ideologues, Alexander Dugin. So you have to do a kind of critical work in order to, you know, turn multipolarity into a productive analytical tool. And this is what we try to make, shifting the focus from the analysis of supposedly already established poles to the processes of pole formation. We think that in the contemporary world, there are many poles that are emerging. And more often than not, the geography of these poles is an overlapping geography. So you cannot trace the boundaries of the poles on a map according to the model that has been used for many years now for nation states in world atlases. You know. So looking at this process of pole formation allows analyzing, of course, the roles played by states, and in particular by big states, by what we call continental imperial states. But it also allows emphasizing that the role of the states is far from exclusive. And so we look at the way in which operations of capital produce their own spaces. We call them operative spaces through the kind of intermingled effect of the operations of financial capital, logistical capital, extractive capital. We look at the capital invested in big infrastructural projects in particular. And so if you do that, you have different kind of cartographies that are not easy to superimpose on each other. And this is what we think is particularly interesting today. I have to add that, of course, there is always the possibility of a simplification of these complex and nested geographies. There is always the possibility of a transformation of poles into blocks, to use a term that has a heavy military resonance. And maybe this is our suggestion in the book. It is on this level that a theory of imperialism for our times can be reframed.
Yeah, I think the shift from reproduction into poles, particularly the sort of the framing of the multipolar world is really interesting. And I guess one of the questions that I had, maybe coming back to this question of territory that you had mentioned earlier when talking about the sort of conjunctural analysis, is that, it seems like there's and so I think for many years there were theoretical and also very empirical work that was sort of pushing people to see the world more in a sort of a deterritorialized sort of way, where the sort of the needs for capital to kind of reduce space and time and to sort of increase turnover. The digitalization of the world over the past 30, 40 years has created lots of literature that's around deterritorialization. And I think that, what this book does is, and, other books as well have said, we should think a little bit more deeply about what that means and look at some of these pushes for reterritorialization. But what I think is important in your book is that, this book is always cautious not to say, oh, well, the sort of the less territorial or the deterritorial is gone and we're just back to trench warfare or something, right? That it's in fact, we can't just reverse either. And that at the same time, there are both these sort of pushes and pulls of territorialization and deterritorialization. I'm wondering, to get back to this question of pulls, if the nation state is no longer sort of sufficient as a term or a capsule for thinking about these poles, do we see some of these efforts for sort of reterritorialization as states like realizing that and trying to shore up some of the power that they've realized they've lost? Like, are these sort of vain attempts at getting back some of that power that's maybe been spread out through things like special economic zones or some of these larger sort of industrial investments from private capital?
Well, whether the attempts are vain or not, we will have to see as history unfolds before us. But certainly, we do face this dilemma in writing about multipolarity with respect to processes of circulation and what we call operative spaces. because you could see our move towards talking about circulation and operation as a kind of deterritorializing move. States can no longer fully control the reproduction of capital. Therefore, they try and reach out and control circulation in some way, and that means reaching beyond territory as traditionally conceived in a kind of international relations kind of frame. But we do face this dilemma when we talk about multipolarity and the process of pole formation, because as we just did in the process of writing, we found ourselves continually falling back on using terms like the Russian pole or the Chinese pole, the Brazilian pole, and so forth. Just in the, in the kind of struggle of constructing a sentence. So we had to say to ourselves, what's going on here? Our argument is going one way, but our nomenclature is kind of pulling us the other way. And what do we do about this? We have all sorts of kind of rhetorical tricks we can pull, like there's part of the book called China Beyond China, where we're looking at, China in Africa and how those kinds of relations are conceived. But I think there's something kind of deeper in this kind of nomenclature problem that we did have, and it relates precisely to the question you're asking about processes of reterritorialization in the world today. And certainly we could see them as, a kind of throwback to an older imperial territorialization. And we need to think that through. But that older imperial territorialization was always, it was never to create a kind of homogeneous imperial territory. It was also always shot through with heterogeneity, both in terms of its political forms, its legal forms, and its economic forms. I mean, we only have to read the history books to see this. So when I say those efforts of the state may not be in vain, I don't see it as a kind of simple return to a kind of homogeneous territorializing logic. Reterritorialization, once you have been through processes of deterritorialization, doesn't look the same. It's always going to be shot through with what has unfolded historically before. So, for instance, in what we might think of as reterritorializing processes now, we see the question of circulation emerging. We see the question of, just to take an obvious example, control over rare earth supplies emerging. We see the question of, let's set up a data center in Abu Dhabi and run our AI from there, which is, a data center itself it makes its own territory through a different logic, not the logic of, a kind of territorial expanse bordered in the traditional way, but through a kind of servant-client relationship, and all the kind of protocols that control that particular relation. When we come to think about territory these days, we need to be thinking around those kinds of relations as well as the traditional international ones. Of course, these things always cross each other in complex ways and will continue to. But I think at the analytical and political level, we need to be attentive to that cross-hatching as we go ahead, because to simply say it's a narrative of reterritorialization is going to, maybe obscure in a way that's not politically helpful the different forms of territorialization that are unfolding in the world today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think well, I'll say two quick things. One is that the sort of the operative spaces, I think, that you're mentioning are also largely informed for our listeners that are not aware of of your previous book that you've written together, The Politics of Operations. So another great book for listeners that are interested in that. I think the other thing that I wanted to point out in the book as well is, like, you sort of not only speak to sort of territory in this expansive sense, but also some of the internal negotiations of states and their territories, the sorts of rebordering, or even how states are kind of internally negotiating their own space in the state that exists currently, where certain segments are sort of left a little bit more deprived or others are invested in, and that some of these changes can be as equally influential as the sort of re-territorialization outside of some of those pre-existing borders. And I think lastly, I'll just mention, I think that here, what this book does well, I think, along with other works, is to really emphasize that, I think, from the geopolitical perspective, it seems clear that there are tensions between nations. But if we only look at that perspective, sometimes we can assume a certain unity on the side of capital, that we sort of maybe downplay some of the intercapitalist competition and favor the sort of the state, sort of like peacocking in a certain way, right? Like that states are sort of confrontational with each other, but we assume a certain level of agreement among the capitalist class. And I think that this book does a nice job of differentiating that and saying it's not that, we don't want to go too far from one side or the other. We don't want to assume some level of like agreement amongst the elites of all of these states, nor do we want to assume an agreement at the sort of level of the capitalist class. And that being able to identify, I think, in these questions of territories where we get to see, for example, who gets to build their data center where, or you spend a lot of time in the book talking about the Nord Stream pipeline, right? What was that? Who did that? At not only at a level of sort of capital and private capital investment, but also at this sort of as like an anchor of geopolitics as well. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as we have this discussion for our listeners, is that like we might feel we might feel this sort of like a unified oppression from the level of the capitalist class, but it doesn't mean that they're always in agreement with each other either. Right. So let's should we talk about struggle? Maybe this was like the last, I don't know if either of you wanted to add any more about poles or conjuncture or reproduction.
Well, of course, there would be much to add, but maybe later if there are some questions. For now, I'd like to say something about struggles. The last chapter of the book is entitled Poles of Struggles. And more generally, the analysis we pursue in the book of these emerging assemblages of state and capital, analysis, which means that what interests us is to discern the contours of new emerging relations of domination and exploitation. We look at capital from this point of view, not from a neutral economical point of view, of course. But then our analysis of struggles is directly connected to the question of multipolarity, and in particular to our focus on what I was calling before pole formation. I was saying in processes of pole formation, of course, states play important role, but then you have to look at capitalist actors, operations of capital. You have to combine an analysis of political spaces with an analysis of operative spaces of capital. And this has a lot to do with what Brett was saying about territorialization. But we also add that in order to get a full picture of processes of power formation, you have to look at social struggles and movements. You have to consider social struggles and movements in their stretching across national spaces as, let's say, geopolitical factors, geopolitical forces. And we are convinced that it is only from the development of social struggles and movements that a more open multipolarity can emerge. We are convinced that freedom and equality are at stake in the future shape of multipolarity, and social struggles and movements have outstanding roles to play in this process. We provide several examples in the book. I will just say a couple of words on Latin America. That is a good instance of the multiple ways in which heterogeneous struggles, movements, political forces can contribute to open new political spaces. In the book, in the last chapter of the book, we describe the way in which new forms of social struggles, new social movements since the late 1990s were able to open a new regional political space in Latin America. And this is not a success story. It is a very contradictory kind of process in which there have been successes and setbacks, of course. But it is very important because it demonstrates the possibility, to open new political spaces from the action of movements and struggles. Just to conclude, we are also convinced that in the turbulent multipolar world in which we are living, a world haunted by war, there is a need to rethink internationalism or to imagine something that can correspond to the roles historically played by socialist and communist internationalism. And from this point of view, we work with the hypothesis that the emerging regional spaces, the emerging poles can provide the groundwork for experimenting with new forms of internationalism, or whatever will be the name.
I think it's maybe important to say something about our use of world systems theory in the book, because part of what's happening at the theoretical, analytical kind of level in this book is a working through that body of theory and that way of theorizing capitalism, which is one that's always been present in our work, but I would say is more amplified in this particular text. And that body of work gives us a way to think about geopolitical and geoeconomic transition and how they relate, but also the role of social struggles in these transitions. So, you see it very clearly in some of the work of Origi and Beverly Silver, where they talk about when you have a geopolitical or geoeconomic transition, and we can talk about what that is in the world today. Clearly, we don't think it's a transition from one dominant pole to another, say to some kind of sinocentric world. But these kinds of transitions have their on-the-ground effects. And the primary example we use in this case are the 2019 Hong Kong struggles, where you see a very clear, it has a territorial logic to it, although the territorial logic is complex because of the notion of the Greater Bay Area that plays out in that part of the world, not the San Francisco Bay, it's another Bay Area. But it's, in that case, you see a struggle that is vanquished, but has its kind of ricochet effects. For example, in present-day Taiwan, which is a place that we've, visited in the past couple of years, where you see very tight kind of geopolitical tensions amplified in distinct ways, with implications for supply chains, with implications for the kind of equipment and micro technologies that are very much at stake in trade wars and multipolar dynamics. However, seeing how these play out in and through social struggles is an important part of our analysis. So the notion of poles of struggle is continually trying to bring us back to this element of social antagonism, and to try and think that in a way which is not simply reactive. So what's happening in Hong Kong is not simply a reaction to what the PRC is doing, but it has its history, and in the present moment it also has its kind of latency, which we will have to see again how it plays out as things evolve in that part of the world.
Yeah. I want to. We have a comment here in our YouTube chat that I'll get to here in a second. And for any of our other listeners, if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to just put it in the comment section, and we'll do our best to get to it. You had mentioned the sort of the need to rethink internationalism, particularly with the sort of the socialist and communist traditions, where internationalism was built into the sort of the understanding of the USSR as this bloc, for better, for worse. And I think that, I'm curious about a lot of this book focuses, again, on the sort of this move toward a regional autonomy, particularly in Latin America, although obviously it could happen other places as well. Where do you see the sort of successes of socialist or communist movements happening in that push toward regional autonomy? Has it been, what are they playing roles in these movements that you think are successful, or has it been a movement sort of despite these sort of socialist and communist attempts to try and create this this internationalism. Sandro, I think you're on mute.
You're muted. Yeah.
Sorry. Times are dark, so it's not very easy to find good instantiations of a new expansive politics of liberation. But I think there were in recent years significant experiments, at least. If you think of Latin America in the first decade of the century, you know, there was a process, or there were multiple processes of regional integration that basically were foreshadowing a kind of reformist regulation of capitalist development, to put it very quickly, you know. But at the same time, there was a continuity of insurgent movements. And it is precisely this kind of dualism that I think is interesting, because it points to the possibility of, you know, opening processes of transition that are open-ended. Processes of transition predicated upon this duality, that is also in a way a duality of power, to mention an issue that Brett and I have addressed in previous writings. And then regarding internationalism, you know, there is a lot of work that is being done on the ground. It is not, you know, just a fantasy, just, you know, a vision. We need also visions, but the visions that we need must be rooted in actual practices of communication and exchange, and these practices exist. So the point is, first of all, you know, to enhance these practices, to build new bridges, to build new platforms, to multiply in a way the channels of communication, to invent an internationalism that becomes a part and parcel of the daily experience of activists. You know, if you think of recent years, internationalism, think of the alter global movement of the late 1990s, early 2000s. That was a great internationalist experience. By the way, Brett and I met at a European Social Forum in Florence, in Italy, in 2002. So that season is important for us, even personally, you know. But at the same time, what was internationalism? It was, you know, jumping from one meeting to another meeting, and then there was a kind of activist elite that was doing that, while activists on the ground not able, of course, to travel in such a compulsive way, you know. And this is something we have to keep in mind. The internationalism we need must build, of course, also on that experience, but must find other ways to develop, you know. It is not absolutely necessary to travel from Seattle to Bogota to have a relation between movements based in the state of Washington and in Colombia. You know what I mean? There are other possibilities, and these possibilities are closely linked to what Brett and I call the labor of translation, which is not only linguistic translation, it is also kind of conceptual and political translation. But maybe Brett want to add something on this.
Yeah, well, we're, you know, in our own modest way, you could say we're doing a version of internationalism right now. I mean, the light in my room is getting brighter, and it's dark where Sandro is. So it's and then it's another time of the day on the west coast of the US. But we're doing this in the global English, which is often a direction in which things are channeled or pushed for reasons of communication. Either the global English or the global Mandarin is, these kinds of vernaculars kind of become, in a way, kinds of matrices of communication. But I think that to think about solidarity in this way, where it has to pass through these major channels, is a kind of mistake that we're always trying to work both through and against, particularly through what Sandro has mentioned, what we call the labor of translation. I mean, maybe one way of getting to this is thinking about the relation between subjectivity and solidarity. You could say, you have a kind of version of solidarity where you have to build up your own sense of political subjectivity, your own sense of the movement you're involved in locally, what it's doing, what it's winning, what its limits are, and then you move from a security in that kind of intervention to some kind of bridging mechanism, whether it's a communication with another movement, some form of exchange, sharing of strategies, and so forth. The labor of translation we see as very much a solidarity working in a different kind of way, where there has to be some kind of unsettling of your own position and your own location and your own subjectivity in order to have that kind of opening and dialogue and a meaningful communication. So again, it's not just a matter of language, although language is an obvious way of illustrating this, but it's a matter of approaching solidarity seriously in a way that it's not just a kind of, a gesture, some kind of social media post that says we're with you, but nor is it a mode of having this secure position in which you then speak for another. We have to keep all of those kind of, post/decolonial dynamics in place when we think about this question. So the labor of translation is a way of us trying to think through those kinds of relations. And we see that as crucial to what internationalism may be and may become.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that that's also been seen just I mean, there's a whole section of the book that, you know, maybe we don't have time to get to, but, you know, the sort of the digitalization, the platformization, these kinds of components that are I think really well brought into a book that, you know, you're thinking is sort of only about, it's bringing that sort of geopolitical sort of and social component to these platforms, I think is really interesting. But I think as it pertains to struggle, at least, you know, over the past 10, 15 years, it seems like so much of the kind of internationalism that's happened has been sort of people that are involved in social movements see something happen across the globe and they are like, oh, I've never seen that before, I want to try it, right? And so even, you know, you mentioned Hong Kong, and so, you know, the sort of the even if you just look at like the sort of street tactics of movements, the use of umbrellas, the use of laser pointers, all of these different things are, it very rarely is it someone, you know, like going, you know, flying from one place to the other and then being like, okay, here's how to do it. It's kids, it's people, it's anybody who's just seeing things on the internet, right? All of these sort of social movements have been platformed in a certain way where people say, oh, I hadn't thought about that, let me try it, right? Let me try and take the cone over the tear gas canister and see what happens. And so, you know, there's also this kind of, speaking of this move of translation, I think it brings us back to this question of territory in an interesting way, because there's lots of times where people see something across the globe and they try it in their hometown and it totally fails, right? And some of the answers for that are territorial, right? It's not you think you're in the same space, but you're not. And so, you know, it's a sort of an ask to reflect on the ability to sort of see these tactics tried out across the globe, but then confront one's own position in the world, where there is this kind of deterritorial, I can see it from my bedroom, but a reterritorial pull of, well, does it actually work here, or could it, right? And, you know, territory is not the only factor there, but it's, you know, it's certainly one of them. So, all right, I want to go to the question we have in the chat here, which is ultimately around coming back to this question of territory and borders and states. So Philip is asking sort of, are we moving toward a time where nations choose to be sort of eternally undefined shapeshifters, keeping the status of their borders vague? So is there some benefit to states to having vague borders? And some of the examples he gives have to do with like Israel and the West Bank, for example. So you have these sort of occupied territories. Maybe they're actually part of the state borders, maybe they're not. Is there some sort of benefit to this ambiguity for states? And do we see that as maybe a factor in some of these questions of territory for other states moving forward?
You know, one could frame the answer in terms of the distinction between border and frontier. Border is a line, frontier is an open space, as you know from the mythology of the frontier in the US that corresponded to the reality of genocide for indigenous people. I think that the reopening of the frontier is kind of a scaring possibility today, and the reference to the Middle East, to Gaza, to Israel, you know, and to the regional dimension of what is happening in and around Gaza is an instance. And in a way, also the rhetoric of Trump points at turning some borders into frontiers. At the same time, we have to take into account that the borders are increasingly closed and militarized with respect to the movement of migrants and refugees. And my suggestion is to think together these two processes that regard borders today. On the one hand, shifting boundaries, the coming back of the frontier. On the other hand, militarization and closure, closure that corresponds to a hardening of social relations within bounded spaces. If we think together these two processes, maybe we also have yet another instance of the relevance, but also of the elusiveness of territory today.
Yeah, the closure of a border, the militarization of a border often has a kind of frontier logic to it. I mean, where I live in Australia, we've had borders effectively closed to migrant flows coming over the oceans since, well, 2013 might be a good date. But the operation of closing a border is not simply walling. It has a kind of frontier kind of logic to it. So in the case of Australia, you have to look at places like Batam Island, just off the coast of Indonesia, where there's a big, detention center run by, International Organization for Migration. You have to look at military to military agreements between Australia and Indonesia. You have to look at advertising campaigns being sent to publics in Sri Lanka saying, "Don't come here." So, I mean, what in the US is often called the idea of the vertical border in Mexico, about which people will know, also has to be thought through with respect to this frontier logic and the mechanisms of walling that are unfolding before us.
Thank you. So maybe I'll offer just one last question, and we can kind of wrap it up after that. So I think my last question kind of comes back to the inversion of the question of the concept of political capitalism, and I think that it's an interesting. I like the way that you've done this, in the sense that rather than see sort of states being able to reassert their dominance over capital in terms of making, sort of being able to make it do what it wants, that there's actually this feeling that there's this too little too late from the state and its ability to control capital. And I'm curious how this relates to some of the other mostly Marxist debates around the falling rate of profit, because I think there's certain perspectives that see capital also is increasingly unable to do the things that it wants, which is have a positive return on investment at a desirable rate of return, essentially. So I'm curious. It seems like there's sort of, do you all feel like the sort of the power of capital is growing, or is it simply that the power of capital and the power of the state are decreasing, but the state is maybe a little bit faster? What directions do we feel like these sort of two forces are going in?
Well, I'm just trying to think this through on my feet. It's a nice question. For me, it's a question of scaling. Where are we trying to answer this question? It's if I think about this question with respect to China, I think about it differently than I would think about it with respect to, Latin America or Europe. So our discourse of political capitalism one aspect of it is a way of working through and dealing with the concept of state capitalism, which is a dominant analytical category these days to analyze a form of capitalism which, kind of appears in the cracked mirror of the neoliberal. There's some kind of aberrant version because the state is too involved, because you have a state-owned enterprise, something like this. There you have a discourse of state control of capital, which is, of course, leaky in many ways. Let's say if we look at the instance of China and the role of private capital in China as well as state capital cannot be forgotten in any analysis of what's happening in that particular part of the world. But the other question that comes up here, I think, with respect more to the kind of financial dynamics is the question of currency and the whole question of de-dollarization and so forth, which maps directly into multipolar dynamics. And the analysis we have of that process in the book is one that's, looking at renminbi internationalization, for instance, is one that's very much cast between the need in order to, strengthen the financial position of that particular currency. You need both external parties paying for trade in the currency, as happening with the, Russia's kind of purchases from China since the Ukraine war. But you also need an openness of people being able to invest in renminbi held overseas into the Chinese financial markets. So it's not, you can't kind of block it in terms of the financial system and in terms of capital markets. This is the point that's made many, many times with respect to trade wars. I guess now we see tariffs having a particular kind of hit on the financial system. There is a relation, they're not completely independent systems, but the volume of trade in finance is much larger than that in trade. And there is that kind of, there has to be a degree of openness in order to close around the strength of a currency. You're well aware in the US of the debates around Mar-a-Lago Accord, and if there is a program or if there isn't a program, how do you maintain the position of the dollar while weakening it? There's a similar kind of dynamic going on there. So I would point to those kinds of debates. But maybe we have to say something very briefly more about political capitalism and the way it allows us to see continuities rather than just differences between, a kind of proper capitalism and an aberrant capitalism.
Yes. Following up on what Brett was saying about currencies and the dollar, just to take Moody's downgrade of US credit rating. This is a very important event, also from the point of view of the position of the dollar, because the downgrade threatens the profitability of US financial assets that are crucial for the dollar. So in such a situation, you can say that both the US state, the US federal power, and the US capital are in a position of weakness, are facing real challenges. And in a way, the crisis of US global hegemony is one of the defining hypotheses for the framework of the rest and the West. The notion of political capitalism, as we understand it, is a flexible notion. Usually political capitalism is understood as referring to a situation in which the state dominates economic development with corruption, clientelism, and so on. We do not propose a sheer reversal. We don't say it is capital that dominates the state. We rather emphasize that what we call operations of capital have essential political implications. And this is very clear, for instance, if you look at the digital platforms, and in particular at big infrastructural platforms. So operations of capital have political implications, and these political implications impinge on the state. But then I repeat, the framework we propose is a flexible framework. We are aware of the fact that the position of the state with respect to capital is different in China and in Italy, But nonetheless, also in China, you can see very clearly the political implications of operations of capital. And in the book, we try to provide an analysis of these implications. These implications that, in a way, are obscured by such a notion as state capitalism. That, again, proposes the idea that the state dominates capital. But this is not the case in China, It is different. It is much more articulated, and it would be nice to have more time to talk about that. So I think that yes, political capitalism, in the way in which we understand it, can be kind of effective and flexible framework for the analysis of emerging, assemblages of state and capital.
Great. Well, thank you both very much for your time. That's all we have for today. So once again, the book is The Rest and the West, Capital and Power in a Multipolar World. It's out on Verso magazine, Verso as the publishers. So you can check out Verso books for that. One last time, we have several more events this month of May. If you are interested in supporting us, either through a one-time donation, you can do that through our GoFundMe, which you'll see at the lower part of your screen here. We also have a Patreon account if you'd like to be a sustaining member that supports Red May. And lastly, redmayseattle.org is our website where you can find all the information about how to donate, as well as where you can find more information about our upcoming events. So we will see you next time. Thanks again to Brett and Sandro, and thanks to all of you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.